Hi everyone, welcome to this, the first lecture on constructivism. We're going to follow Wendt for our definition of constructivism. We're already sort of prepared for it in some ways though, because we have dealt with the English school up to now. We did that last week and now we're looking at constructivism. The English school is something that exists probably prior to Wendt, and that Wendt wants to sort of bring in, I think, and is bringing in elements of the English school into constructivism. So we'll talk about that a little bit. Quick note, I suppose, on this lecture, when I delivered this in person, it was the most difficult, I think, for the students to, one of the more difficult lectures for students to fully grasp. I talked to the students in the classroom about it afterwards, and they expressed some, difficulty, some feelings like they weren't any further ahead with their knowledge of constructivism. I think I'm taking it from Wendt. I'm going to present it in much the same way I presented the other lectures and certainly the ones I did in class. I'd say, though, that this might not be like the other two. You might find the other two more straightforward. If you're only going to watch one, this one might not be the one to watch. But the good thing about this one, and the thing that I guess makes it, I think, one of my favorites, is that it really deals with the foundations, theoretical foundations, ontological, epistemological foundations of constructivism, and it puts it in the context of the theories like neo-realism and neoliberalism that we've already discussed, right? So this is a sort of a very base foundation. When I say base, I don't mean basic. This is not simple, but the stuff that we'll discuss, it lays at the very basis of constructivism, the very foundation of it. And so I think that's why it might be slightly more difficult than the other lectures. Anyway, from a student's point of view. Okay, let's look at it though. But first, I will share my screen because otherwise it won't work. All right, off we go. So I'm taking this again from Wendt. The term constructivism can have a bit of a wider application, even within international relations. Like I said, things like the English school, things like critical theory, and some sort of post-Marxian approaches to international relations. Well, they probably formed, to be honest, the origination of constructivism. I mean, constructivism probably starts in those strands, but Wendt tries to tie those together and tries to sort of police constructivism and sort of produce a sort of a homogeneous, sort of maybe even sanitized constructivism that's able to directly relate to realism and neo-realism, which is why it's probably good for an undergraduate class, and also why it's very popular, I suppose, amongst scholars of international relations. But bear in mind that this is one particular viewpoint, and it might be the more straightforward viewpoint as well. So interesting. Where's this? We're going to talk now about the theoretical space where this is taking place, where constructivism comes in. Constructivism is, in terms of time dimensions, right? It's later than realism and later than neo-realism. And what Wendt wants to do is he takes neo-realism and neoliberalism, Waltz and Cohen, who we've discussed already in this class, as his sort of target audience in some way. He wants to address them. He doesn't think that neo-realism or neoliberalism they haven't been entirely satisfactory in terms of explaining international politics. And so he thinks that they're lacking. But he thinks that they're lacking to the point that he wants to make them right. He wants to correct them in some way. He wants to certainly address them, address their failings, and he thinks perhaps supplement them in some way, right? They need supplementing, but they can be supplemented. Some of the earlier people that might sort of fit into the story of constructivism who came like before Wendt, they might have, Ashley, for example, who you've read, or who you can read if you'd like to go back to the realism module and read his now, doesn't really see anything, I think, salvageable in neo-realism. Wendt does, right? Which leads Wendt to sort of downplay a little bit the strand of critical international relations that Ashley really starts, I suppose. So so neorealism and neoliberalism, that's his opposition, but that's also his sort of frame of reference. That's who he's addressing. And he tries to put in order previous constructivist theory. So I talked about Ashley already, Ashley and Walker, Bull of the English school, feminists as well. Like he wants to, when I say put them in order, he wants to sort of take what he can use from them in a way that, again, addresses and speaks to the mainstream of international relations, which in some cases, I'd say, particularly in the Ashley and Walker sort of constructivist theory, and probably in feminism too, I think in some ways sort of misses the point, right? But these are I think fundamental, fairly radical rejections of mainstream international relations, but Wendt really wants to not radically question. He wants to sort of he wants to get along with the realists, I think, with the neo-realists and the neoliberals, while disagreeing with them still, right? And I think he probably sees Ashley and Walker as a little bit too radical. Anyway, he's attempting to marshal constructivists against neo-realists and neoliberals on the field built by Walt. So he wants to go to that place. He wants to go to that. He's not just rejecting it outright. He wants to take that seriously. He wants to take Waltz seriously, which is not a bad approach. Since he's so popular and powerful in the discipline, you probably should to some extent, right, take him seriously. But he wants to not only does he want to take him seriously, but he wants to maybe accept some of the assumptions of neorealism, right? At least some of them. In particular, right, he wants to his theory, his idea of constructivism, he wants to sort of base it on the systemic level. Remember those levels of analysis: systemic level, unit level, individual level. He wants to have a systemic level constructivism. So here are some of the sort of basic theoretical assumptions of constructivism. One is, sort of an embracing of state centrism. States are important. They are the real actors. He accepts states as the real actors in international politics. Again, systems theory, right? Look, the dependent variable, he says, should be the system as a whole, not the units. Right? So, yeah, fair enough. Like Walt says, we're going to also, we constructivists, we Wendian constructivists, we're going to focus on the international system itself and not on the units. But we think, unlike Waltz, right, that there might be some variation in the agents that might affect the structure. Right, so this is the first sort of point of departure, if you like, that Wendt is making from the neo-realists. But we can see how it's based on a neo-realist understanding of the system. Right, there's a system out there built with different units. Waltz says, these units are all the same, so we don't learn anything by focusing on the units. And Wendt is going to say, no, the type of unit, the nature of the unit affects the system, the structure. So there we go. But he still wants to look at, well, how do those units, changes in those units, affect the overall structure? So it's still a structural level approach, says Wendt. He says, look, neorealism also fails to deal with the construction of actors, which is one of the functions of a system. There's individualist and materialist. There's a neglect of the interaction. Waltz wants to focus in on the interaction between states, how these states come into being, how units in the system, how do they come into being? Right? The system sort of creates them, and they create one another. And that's what Wendt wants to look at, right? How do states come into being in the system? How does the system sort of shape them, as well as how they shape the system? But also, and we'll see more of that later, that's an important concept I just sort of rifled through there, but we'll go into more detail in a little bit. But then also, this is, the interaction between them. How does that create them? Neorealism, he says, also fails to deal with the possibility of change in the structure, like away from anarchy. What kind of structure? Like, yes, sure, there's a structure, and there's a relationship, but the overall sort of organizing dynamic of the structure in neorealism is anarchy, right? So that's why we have duplication of you remember this from the realism lectures, right? But Walt says, well, sorry, Wendt, this is we're talking about Alexander Wendt. Wendt says, no, there is a possibility of change, right? There's agency here, right? These units have agency, and the way that they interact with each other, the way that they deal with one another, that can change the nature of the structure. Walt, remember, says, no, it's not going to change. It's going to be anarchic the whole time. That's not going to change. States are not going to change. Wendt says, no, they can change. But notice that he's still adopting Wendt's idea of what the political system the international system looks like, that it exists and that it's made of units that are the states, right? So it still has those things. Now, Wendt talks about these things, these four sociologies. He's trying to figure out now sort of how things come into being, to what extent a structure is made of ideas, and to what extent are they made of material. So, you know, the materialists will say, look, human nature, natural resources, geography, forces of production, forces of destruction, those are the things that exist. They're the real things, right? And so anything that exists, anything that comes into being is brought about by these things, right? And remember, right, if we go to the back before Walt, if we go to Morgenthau, you know, what does he think? What does he think makes up the international politics? Well, human nature is a big thing, right? So we can call him a materialist, right? The realists, we can call them materialists. You know, and then if we think about the power that we've been talking about in the realist lectures, well, what makes power? Natural resources, geography, forces of production, forces of destruction, right? Military, with Mearsheimer, for example. So those are the materialists. But the idealists say, no, it's about norms, rules, institutions. And, you know, sometimes you might be able to attribute that maybe to the liberals to some degree, right? Institutions are constituting identities and interests. Remember, when we talked a little bit about game theory, we talked about the prisoner's dilemma. We said things like, if we have states that are interacting more than once, right, within institutions, and if those institutions are sort of ongoing and create multiple chances, time upon time upon time, for the same actors to talk to each other to make deals, that they're more likely to behave in a certain way, and so it's not much further past that to say, yeah, and actually their interests change as they come into contact with one another, right? And also, you know, it is rules and norms. So you can think back to the English school, right? That you want to say Barry Bouzan, but we didn't actually talk about Barry Bouzan. Who did you talk about? Hedley Bull, of course. Hedley Bull, his international society was about these shared norms and values that exist and that create a particular kind of a system, right? An international society where, you know, it's not just anarchic, right? And so you can see that might fit more in with the English school, that idealists sort of sociology there. The other axis, because this four sociologies is made up of an axis, right, where, you know, on one axis you've got material on this side, ideational on this side, and on the other one you've got individualism at the top of holism. And so you've got a materialist individualism, and then you've got a materialist holism, then you've got an ideational individualism and an ideational holism. I think that's all four, right? I think that's as many as you can make with those two axes. So that individualism holism axis is sort of defined in the following way. You know, what difference do structures make? Right? Does it affect the behavior of the units of the states, right? Or does it affect the actual constitution, like how those states are? Right? Is it behavior or identity? Maybe identity, but I think constitution is the best word, which is why I put it up there, like how they. But I'm not talking about constitution as like, you know, like the U.S. Constitution, a written constitution, but something a bit broader than that, right? Is the way that states are made up, the way that they manage themselves, the way that they exist, is that made by the structure, or the states exist the way they exist, and the structure only affects the behavior, the way they interact with them, or the way that they not just the interaction, but any other behavior that they exhibit. So that's this question. Individualists say explanations should be reducible to the properties and interactions of independently existing individuals, right? So under this extreme on this axis, it's that individuals exist independently of the system. Right? The states exist independently of the international system, and they have particular properties, and it's those explanations should be based on that. So we should look at what are the properties of these states in the system, and that will tell us how they will behave. Holists say no, the system itself is creating, it's constituting these agents. And so the example, I think I don't know if I remember if I took this from Wendt or made it up myself. It's certainly related to what I do for a living, right? But professors cannot be professors without students. And so there's some sort of a system, right? The academic system or the university system or something like that you can call it, right? Where that creates me and it creates you, and it gives us distinct roles. And like I outside of that system, I don't exist, or I'm not the same, at least, right? You know, and you can kind of imagine, right, that I'm not the sort of behaviors that I'm like, well, it's not just the behaviors that I'm exhibiting. So it's not that just the being in this particular setting with you in this class, it's not that just makes me behave in a different way. It's that it makes me something different, right? It makes me into an instructor which has a certain set of properties. You know, one of the properties being like that I can talk for ages on these videos and think that you should be listening, right? Something like that. But that's is that a behavior, or is that like a constitution? Is that a part of being, a part of who I am? So that's the sort of individualism and holism distinction. You know, do systems construct actors, or do they merely constrain actors, independently existing actors? All right, this is that part where we get to that I said was fairly important, and I've mentioned it earlier, and I've mentioned it 2 or 3 times now in passing, but this gets to the crux of constructivism, and it's something we could probably understand before the end of this lecture, right? And it's this. We've got 2 types of relationships here, and actually Wendt is going to look at them both, right? But between you and me, right, well, it's not just between you and me, but let me tell you, the most important one in terms of constructivism is the constitutive relationships. Before you can start messing about with causal relationships, which Wendt wants to look at, he says he wants to look at causal relationships too, like the neo-realists, like the neoliberals, but the thing that they don't do for Wendt, and the thing that Wendt wants to do, the thing that he's adding to those guys, is this idea of a constitutive relationship. So causal relationship, you should probably be most of you familiar with what we would mean by that, right? A causal relationship is where one thing causes another thing. Now, when you have that, let's imagine just heating up water, right? When you add heat to water, it makes it boil. Okay, so you sort of have to, you know, before you can imagine the boiling, you already have to, before you add the heat to make the boiling water, the heat has got to pre-exist the boiling water, right? The heat has got to exist before the boiling water. If we had boiling water and then we applied heat, we would say, well, the heat is not causing the boiling water because it was already boiling, right? But no, as we add the heat, then the water boils. So the boiling water is a result of the heat, so that the heat exists, and I put temporarily prior, temporarily just in the sense of to do with time, temporarily maybe. It exists temporarily prior to why. The heat exists before the boiling water, which it causes, right? And that's a causal relationship. And so we might want to look in terms of international relations. We might want to say, let's say, increased defense spending causes war. Okay, so again, right, if we have a war and then we have an increase in this defense spending, then we say, well, that's not a causal relationship, at least it's not in the direction that we thought. But if there is an increase in defense spending and then there's a war, right, the increase in defense spending exists independently of the war, and it exists before the war, right? Constitutive relationships, they're different. It says here there's no temporal disjunction. What that means is one doesn't exist before the other, right? They exist they come into being at the same time. The one brings the other into being, and the one that is brought into being also brings the thing into being that existed. Like they bring each other into being. I was almost there, but it's difficult to find the words sometimes, right? Because we're used to thinking in causal relationships, like where do I come from? Like what made me? What makes this light turn on, right? And with those, there's some answers to that, where, the electricity exists prior to the light coming on, or the heating the water, right? The heat exists prior to the boiling water. But in the types of relationships between states, right, the social type relationships that Wendt is interested in, those states bring each other into being. And they bring each other into being in a certain way, having certain properties. So that's the big deal about constructivism. It's about these constitutive relationships. And so Wendt's going to want to think a lot about, like, how does this happen, right? How do they bring each other into being? What types of properties come into being as a result of this relationship? And afterwards, now we can figure out, well, what does that mean for the international system? And then that might be a causal relationship that we'll be investigating, because he's not only wanting to do that one constitutive relationship, but that's the one that we have to figure out, because that's the one that we haven't really been talking about in international politics until, well, I won't say until Wendt comes on, because that's wrong, but until the forerunners of constructivism, of Wendt's constructivism, have come along. And then this is the methodological difference, I guess, between constructivists and maybe neo-realists and neoliberals. Rationalists are asking, like, how do incentives affect the price of behavior, right? So let's take Russia again, since this is the big thing that's happening right now, and it's easy to take it for lots of different examples. So, the United States is trying to incentivize Russia not to invade Ukraine. So it gives threats, right? So if you invade Ukraine, then we'll give these crushing economic sanctions, because they could say, like, if you invade Ukraine, we'll go to war with you, but that's not really a credible threat, right? Because they're not going to go to war with Ukraine with Russia. It would be very expensive, and Russia wouldn't believe that they would pay that price. But, crushing economic sanctions, that would also be expensive to some degree for the United States, but it's more credible, right? Anyway, so a rationalist is looking at that. The thing with that, though, is that in order to be able to answer that question, right, something like how does the United States threat of sanctions affect Russia's behavior, we already have to assume, right? We already have to assume that there's a Russia and that there's the United States, and that they have given interests, like specific interests to them, that exist before this interaction. Whereas constructivism actually might want to look at this interaction as constitutive of the United States and of Russia, right? That this interaction actually brings them both into existence in a certain way, right, with certain properties, that they didn't exist quite in this, because we'll say, well, Russia's existed for this long, and the United States, has existed since the American Revolution, right? And so you'd say, well, so of course we know that they are given, right? These identities are given. But if you'd say that, you'd be agreeing perhaps with maybe some liberals and some realists perhaps. You would be, but you'd be disagreeing with Wendt, because Wendt's going to say, yeah, for sure, like, there's been a country called the United States and there's been a country called Russia, and they have a certain history, but the properties that they're currently said to possess, that they're currently understood to possess, they've only come to possess those, like in this crisis, like right now, right? And it's because of the relationship between them, and it's because of the system in which they're interacting, that they have become this thing that they are right now. And that in the future, right, because remember, he's interested in change, right, how the system might change. In the future, there might be different interactions between them, which might constitute them in different ways. And the United States and Russia would become something different, right? I think I did it better this time than I did in class, to be honest. sometimes it's easier like when you're just talking on your own into a camera, because you've got no distractions or anything like that, and you're sort of just focused on the ideas. But anyway, hopefully it was helpful to you. I guess we have one more slide, which I wasn't quite expecting, and so we'll have a look and go through. Social theory. How can we both be positivist and constructivist? Don't think of it as positivism like we were talking about in the English school with law. That's not what it's about. It's about positivism in this sense. It's a broader term. It's perhaps a methodological term or an epistemological term for sure. And it's the idea that there's a world that's beyond us, that's independent of us, independent of you and me. And as we investigate that world, we discover it how it is, rather than what a constructivist might actually be inclined to say, is that we're, in some ways, our investigations of the world, in some ways constitutive of the world. As we enter into a relationship with that thing that's out there, we participate in its creation. Because the way that we experience it, the ways, and maybe perhaps the way we expect to experience it, sort of influences the way that we actually do experience it, and the things that we look for and the things that we then find. And similarly, as we conduct this investigation into the world is affecting and changing us, right? And so it's mutually constitutive. It makes us, and so if it's making the thing that's investigating it, right, those things are not independent. Right, and so this is where the question comes from, right? How can we both be positivist, think of ourselves as sort of investigating something that's out there independent of ourselves, and a constructivist that thinks that we're both being mutually creating at the same time, and wants to put himself in that position, right, of being both positivist and constructivist, which I think Ashley and Walker, for example, wouldn't do that, right? They would be much more constructivist, right, than they would be positivist. They would almost be maybe post-positivist. So anyway, what Wendt says is this. He says constructivism is an ontology, it's not an epistemology, right? Constructivism is about how things come into being, it's not how we learn about things, right? It's a theory about how things come into being, not a theory about how we learn things, right? Scientific realism, say, look, scientific realism exists, Wendt says, and so scientific realism, it allows us to make ontological claims about unobservables, right? Scientific realism is I mean, think of it in terms of trying to find atoms, right? We're not necessarily looking at atoms, and we're not observing directly perhaps the behavior of electrons, but we can make claims about what they are and how they behave from scientific inquiry, from certain experiments and from certain deductions that we make based on principles that we've already established, and that's scientific realism. And so if we can do that, then we don't have to observe the world, we don't have to enter into this relationship with it, as I was talking about before, in order to investigate it. And so perhaps we can separate ourselves from it. I don't know. We're in quite deep in that one, actually. Probably about as deep as I could go. Ideas all the way down. Is it ideas all the way down? Is the question. This is a big question in international relations, especially when we have to talk about constructivism. It's like, and the question is basically, is there anything other than ideas? Is there any material factors that make things the way they are? And when it says, no, it's not ideas all the way down, but the material forces, material factors explain very little in social life. I'm stealing this example from Roxanne Doty, but from her book Imperial Encounters. But if I butcher it, that's where you should go look for the real one. But here's my adaptation or my remembering of it after a few years having read it. But it's the invasion of Grenada or Honduras or something by US soldiers. And so she's talking about that. She says, okay, if we look at that, what do we see, right? If we observe just the material there, like we see what? We see like men and women, people sort of disembarking from boats and like moving across terrain. Maybe we could talk about metal in their hands, right? You know, that's shaped metal. You know, when we start looking at just the material factors of this story, it's very, very low resolution, right? You know, even to call people men and women, that's already like a little bit social, right? Because we sort of imbue men and women with certain expectations, right? And certain factors and certain qualities, right? That you and I would probably agree on about, you know, what men and women are, right? About, you know, about being intelligent, right? And being able to speak and being able to rationally think, I don't know, things like that, right? We talk about. So men and women's maybe too much. It's like maybe these sort of, but it gets crazy at some point, because you get down to like a level of materialism that's, you know, what do we really know? Well, it's like, it's these cells, right? It's these sort of meat, like these lumps of protein and water, and they're moving across rocks or something, or they're moving across like crushed rocks, sandy beach, and the thing is, like, if we were to describe things like that, it wouldn't mean anything to us, right? We wouldn't understand what we were talking about. Like, we wouldn't really give any meaning to it. It wouldn't mean anything to us. And I keep saying the word meaning over and over again, because that's what it's all about, right? Social theory, right? It's this idea that the meaning that comes from those things, it sort of comes from us. We give it all of its meaning. The observer gives it its meaning. So we see it and we say, okay, well, you know, well, they've got American flags on their, I don't know if this was true or not, but let's say it is. They have American flags up here on their shoulder, right? So, okay, well, these are Americans, right? But of course, being an American is massively social, right? So what does it mean? Oh, they're military, you know, from the American military. Military is sort of a social idea as well. You can't really see military in a material way. It's an idea. It's a way of organizing yourself. And it's with certain purposes, right? In certain sort of forms, social forms, like some patterns. And so, okay, so they're military, and this is not America, right? So now you're starting to say, okay, well, these are soldiers and they're from another country, and they're in this country now, and they have these, what we've, you know, these metal, right? It's guns, right? And guns, you might think of it as a material thing, but really most of the meaning of guns comes from like its ability to, you know, to kill other people, right? To kill other things, to intimidate, right? And so now we're seeing, you know, the more we add to it, right, the more social meaning we add to it, the more meaningful it becomes, the more we understand what's happening. And so when it says, look, it's not ideas all the way down, right? You do at some point get to material factors, but they're very, they don't really explain very much without the social meaning. And then structure, agency, culture. This is the causal versus constitutive that we did already talk about, so I won't talk about it again, but I'll leave you with it, and I hope you enjoyed this lecture.